So another angle of vision is required. Sometimes my lens is journalistic, as I scan for the revealing anecdote. Sometimes it is more historical, a search for deeper connections with the help of archival material from the 1932 to 33 period, or for the leadership secrets behind FDR's swift turnaround of a failing enterprise. Taking a cue from FDR, who referred to himself at Warm Springs, Georgia as Old Doc Roosevelt, I also see my role almost as a doctor examining a patient, in this case, a man who became the most important president since Abraham Lincoln, and the most underestimated. FDR was, by many accounts, the most consequential man of the 20th century. Yet it is now nearly 125 years since his birth and more than 60 years since his death. With that in mind, I've included footnotes with bits of historical context and a few comparisons to recent presidents to help illuminate the main roads of the story. Although the Roosevelt literature is vast, no previous book about FDR has concentrated so closely on his role in the 1932 to 33 period. In recent decades, most authors have focused on the later years of his presidency. FDR may be commonly remembered for bringing victory in World War II, but it's worth recalling that he did so only with the help of the Allies. The first time he saved democracy, in 1933, he accomplished it more on his own, by convincing the American people that they should not give up on their system of government. Before he confronted fascism abroad, he blunted the potential of both fascism and communism at home. Instead of viewing the 100 Days as the opening act of the Roosevelt presidency, the more traditional historical approach, I depict it as the climax of an exquisite piece of political theater. This performance was only possible because of a supreme self-confidence in his ability to lead the country when it was, as he later put it, frozen by a fatalistic terror. The story that follows, then, is not just about the early days of the Roosevelt presidency, but about where his confidence came from and how he used it to win power, restore hope, and redefine the bargain, the deal, the country struck with its own people. The result was a new notion of social obligation, especially in a crisis. In his second inaugural, in 1937, FDR took stock of what had changed. We refused to leave the problems of our common welfare to be solved by the winds of chance and the hurricanes of disaster. We live in an age when the question raised by any work of history is, why now? Roosevelt is of lasting interest not just because we too must face our fears, real and imagined, not just because of a few similarities and many differences between him and another president with a famous name, confronted with big problems. I wrote this book to better understand a few timeless questions about the nature of crisis leadership and the meaning of the American experiment in self-government. What is government for? How can it be mobilized in an emergency to secure safety and ease suffering? Where do hope and inspiration come from, and what might they accomplish? Nations, like politicians, occasionally experience defining moments where their course is fixed for generations in the historical blink of an eye. His most dazzling successes were domestic and psychological, wrote the novelist Saul Bellow, who grew up worshipping Roosevelt in Chicago. It is not too much to say that another America was formed under his influence. My goal is to explain and recreate that psychological success, the one that brought us this new America, a country of commitment to one another, with a set of governing values we are debating anew today. Prologue. Sunday, March 5th, 1933. On this, his first full day in the presidency, Franklin Delano Roosevelt awoke in a creaky, narrow bed in the small bedroom of the White House family quarters he had chosen for himself. After his valet, Irvin McDuffie, helped him with the laborious task of putting on his iron leg braces and trousers, McDuffie lifted him into his armless wooden wheelchair for the elevator ride downstairs. The new president's schedule called for him to attend morning services at St. Thomas's Church with his family, host a luncheon for 20 at the White House, and then chair an emergency cabinet meeting, where he would outline his plans to call Congress into emergency session. None of the staff or reporters who saw him that Sunday noticed that FDR was anything other than his usual convivial self. He had stayed up past 1 o'clock the previous night talking with Lewis Howe, his longtime chief aide and campaign strategist, while Eleanor and their 5 children attended the inaugural ball without him. The crippled president, now 51 years old, hadn't wanted to sit passively while everyone else danced. Passive was not his style. Besides, he and Howe had important things to discuss, beginning with how to extricate the United States from its gravest crisis since the Civil War. The American economic system had gone into a state of shock, its vital organs shutting down as the weekend began. On Friday, the New York Stock Exchange suspended trading indefinitely, and the Chicago Board of Trade bolted its doors for the first time since its founding in 1848. The terrifying runs that began the year before on more than 5,000 failing banks had stripped rural areas of capital and now threatened to overwhelm American cities. At dawn on Saturday, only a few hours before FDR's swearing in, the governors of New York, Illinois, and Pennsylvania signed orders closing the banks in those states indefinitely, which meant that 34 out of 48 American states, including the largest ones, now had no economic pulse. Each state's closure had its own financial logic, but collectively they proved merciful. Without them, Saturday morning would have brought even more ruinous bank runs, with legions of depositors descending on their banks in desperation at the very moment the new president took the oath of office. The outgoing president, Herbert Hoover, was on his way back to California, a study in failure. As late as 1 a.m. on Inauguration Day, he was still haggling with FDR on the telephone about the banking crisis. In late morning, they rode in uncomfortable silence to the Capitol. Hoover's brilliant understanding of complex issues had brought him and the country nothing. For more than 3 years, since the aftermath of the stock market crash, he had been sullen and defensive as disease spread through the American economy. As frightening as life had become since the Great Depression began, this was the bottom, though no one knew that at the time. The official national unemployment rate stood at 25%, but that figure was widely considered to be low. Among non-farm workers, unemployment was more than 37%. And in some areas like Toledo, Ohio, it reached 80%. Business investment was down 90% from 1929. Per capita real income was lower than 3 decades earlier, at the turn of the century. If you were unfortunate enough to have put your money in a bank that went bust, you were wiped out. With no idea whether any banks would reopen, millions of people hid their few remaining assets under their mattresses, where no one could steal them at night without a fight. The savings that many Americans had spent a lifetime accumulating were severely depleted or gone, along with 16 million of their jobs. When would they come back? Maybe never. The great British economist John Maynard Keynes was asked by a reporter the previous summer if there were any precedent for what had happened to the world's economy. He replied yes. It lasted 400 years and was called the Dark Ages. Late in 1933, a prominent journalist, Earl Looker, peered backwards several months to assess the Hobbesian stakes as FDR assumed office. Capitalism itself was at the point of dissolution. Would men continue to work for profit as our forefathers understood it and as our people now understand it? This was a real question, for money was now useless. Would it be necessary soon to organize our families against the world, to fight physically for food, to keep shelter, to hold possessions? Even 2 generations later, the terror remained indelible for those who experienced it. It was just as traumatic as Pearl Harbor or the destruction of the Twin Towers, the scholar Richard E. Neustadt, who was a teenager at the time, recalled. It wasn't on television, but the banks were failing everywhere, so you didn't need television to see what was going on. Roosevelt's inaugural address had begun the process of restoring hope, but not everyone caught the new mood right away. The press coverage that morning largely downplayed or ignored FDR's line, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." The New York Times and most other newspapers relegated the line to their inside pages, while focusing instead on the vivid wartime allusions he employed 5 times during his speech. Martial metaphors that suggested that there was, in fact, plenty to fear after all. The greatest applause from the large crowd on the east side of the Capitol came when Roosevelt said, "I shall ask Congress for the one remaining instrument to meet the crisis, broad executive power to wage war against the emergency, as great as the power that would be given me if we were in fact invaded by a foreign foe." The United States had not been invaded by a foreign foe since 1812, but this felt like it.